Good afternoon. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. And we are coming to you from frigid Dallas, Texas, where many millions of people do not have power, but fortunately we do. So we're able to hold this event. I'd like to welcome you to our Zoom policy discussion today on assessing President Biden's Obamacare reforms, jointly sponsored with the Galen Institute. We do appreciate you all being here with us today. We miss seeing you in person and we miss being able to do in-person events, but hopefully we'll be back to that sooner rather than later. And in the meantime, we're grateful to have technology and power, as I suggested, so that we can still produce these events and still stay in touch with our friends and our audiences and do our jobs. Today's event is a webinar, not a meeting. So if you are attending the webinar today, you will not be on video, which may be a relief to some of you, I understand. But you will be able to ask questions and you will be able to chat in the chat window in Zoom. We will try to take as many of your questions as possible. The way you can ask a question is by using the Q&A feature down at the bottom menu bar of your Zoom window. I see we already have a few questions that have been entered, so that's good. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Unfortunately, my colleague, Dr. Merrill Matthews, who was planning to join us today and co-host the event, is unable to due to lack of electricity at his home. So again, he's one of the many that I described earlier who have spent most of the last 2 days with no electricity, shivering in their home. So send some positive thoughts his way. And I assure you, he would like to be with us were it possible. Apparently in Texas, we're just simply not prepared for a polar vortex like this. And it's caught just about everybody off guard. That's enough from me. So we're going to rely on Grace Marie Turner to handle all of our moderating and guidance jobs today. So let me turn it over to Grace Marie. Many of you know her. She's a longtime healthcare policy expert and founder and president of the Galen Institute. So Grace Marie, thanks so much for helping to put this program together with Dr. Matthews. And thank you for running it in his absence. And take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Tom. And thank you and IPI and especially Merrill. He really did all the heavy lifting in putting together this forum. So we're really sorry he's not able to join us. But are we recording this so he can watch it later? Yes?
Yes, we are recording it. It'll be archived on our website and we can make it available to you as well if you archive video on your website.
That's great. And so we do invite you to put your questions in anytime during the presentation. We've got a bunch of questions that we're going to go through with Brian and Doug to really give us a sense of where the lay of the land with health policy in this new administration. And we also will put some links to articles that they may mention in the chat room. So if you want to make sure you turn on the chat as well. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of where we are, as you know, President Biden was seen during the presidential primary campaign as really the more moderate in his position on health reform. While most of the other Democratic presidential candidates endorsed Medicare for all, he said, nope, we're going to expand and build on Obamacare, something that he's proud of, having helped pass it when he was vice president in the Obama administration. So he sees that as a more moderate position. I think one of the things we'll explore today is whether or not that really is true, or whether or not it's just another stepping stone and a different way of getting to much greater government control of our health sector. And we could not be more fortunate than to have Brian Blase and Doug Badger, both senior fellows at the Galen Institute, to talk with us today about what they see coming. They both have served in senior positions in the White House, the Trump administration with Biden most recently, and with Doug serving as a senior advisor to President George W. Bush. Both of them were hugely influential in major public policy initiatives that lead to choice and competition. There have been a lot of legislative obstacles, but they have done everything they can, both to get legislation through when possible, and also to use the tools of the administration to begin to open up the opportunities and options. So we're going to talk a lot about that and talk about the the agenda of the Biden administration. So let's begin by talking about the big picture. Doug, I wonder if you can just give us kind of an overview. What does President Biden mean when he says expand and build on Obamacare? We're going to get a lot into the details later, but I just sort of give us the big picture, the lay of the land.
Well, thank you, Grace Marie. And for those of you who are in snowbound right now, I apologize. We are visiting my wife's family here in Arizona, and not much opportunity to do this from inside, so I have to rub it in that our weather here is sunny and warm by doing it outside. When President Biden says he's going to build on Obamacare, to sum it up from a somewhat acerbic perspective, what he means is making a costly, inefficient, and suffocating regulatory contrivance more costly, less efficient, and even more suffocating. He largely, this will take the form, and we'll go into this in much more detail in a bit, but largely this will take the form of enlarging the Obamacare subsidies for people who already get them, making people in the two highest income quintiles eligible for Obamacare subsidies, giving everyone on unemployment insurance free Obamacare through the exchanges, and otherwise enlarging the reach of the government. The understanding just why this is considered moderate is really goes to the core of how the left really has been successful, and conservatives have been much less successful in influencing the course of healthcare policy. Progressives begin with a core belief that government can allocate medical goods and services more efficiently and more fairly than can markets. It's a belief that they've cherished for more than a century, and one they cling to despite all evidence of the contrary. So they begin with a shared assumption. But secondly, they have something that conservatives often haven't shown, and that is patience. Progressives has been at the single payer Medicare for all idea for more than a century now. They really didn't achieve much success until the mid-60s with Medicare. And at each step along the way, they've had to say yes to incremental steps, some of which actually conflict with their core views. As we'll see, the bill that Congress is working on right now to expand Obamacare is actually a windfall for the health insurance industry, which those who are committed to Medicare for all would destroy. But nevertheless, they managed to keep discipline and move toward government control in a very systematic, and they play the long game with healthcare policy. And so what we're seeing is what President Biden would call sort of a moderate approach. But as we begin to break it down, we'll see that it actually will have a profound effect in enlarging government's control over the allocation of medical goods and services.
Thank you, Doug. I wonder, Brian, if you would drill down for us a little bit and talk more about the specifics of what we know about what President Biden is proposing so far.
Sure. So I think before I do that, it's crucial to sort of know where we are with Obamacare. So when the law was passed in 2010, if you go back to what the Democrats were talking about, they really promoted the idea of these health insurance exchanges where people would be able to go and purchase coverage that would be affordable in a competitive marketplace. It was by far the number one benefit of the law that the Democrats talked about at the time. And the reality is that those exchanges and those policies, that sort of complicated regulatory mandate subsidy structure hasn't worked. They were, if you look at projections, they estimated we'd have about 25 million people enrolled in the exchanges right now. We have about 10 million people. Total individual market enrollment has increased by about 2 million since pre-ACA levels. Now that's a 2 million increase, and we're spending $50 billion a year in premium subsidies. That worked out to $25,000 per newly insured individual in the individual market. If you account for the fact that there's been a slight decline in employer-sponsored insurance, which is attributable to the ACA, you basically had no change in private health insurance enrollment, despite spending almost about $50 billion in subsidies. What is the ACA mostly? It's mostly a Medicaid expansion. About 3 dozen states have expanded Medicaid, and we've had a decrease in the number of uninsured by probably about 12 to 13 million overall, largely through the Medicaid expansion. Now, what is sort of, if you can think about the main goal of the Biden administration right now and the Democrats in Congress is to get more people enrolled in Obamacare, in both the exchanges and in Medicaid. So in the exchanges, they're, like Doug previewed, they're going after their main vulnerability, that in people that don't get subsidies aren't purchasing this coverage. So instead of like looking at ways that would reduce premiums and make plans more affordable overall, they're just pumping up the subsidies. So they have a proposal that significantly expands the subsidies, both for individuals that already receive subsidies to purchase insurance. Plus, right now the subsidies are capped at 400% of the poverty line. They would lift that cap. In essence, you have some families that make $200,000 or more that would now qualify for these subsidies to purchase insurance in the individual market. CBO, so they've limited this to 2 years. And CBO produced an analysis last week, and they estimate that the total spending increase from this is going to be about $35 billion, with, like Doug said, 2/3 of the spending increase going to people who are already covered. And it'll bring a few, I think 1 million or 2 more individuals into the market who don't have insurance. They're also looking at ways to make Medicaid expansion more attractive to the states that haven't expanded yet. So there are some big states like Florida and Texas that haven't expanded. And when we get into talking about the Medicaid expansion, we can talk about some of the reasons those states haven't expanded their Medicaid program. But there's a variety of things that they're looking at that would make it more attractive to states to expand Medicaid.
Looking at the impact of Obamacare, we have seen that because of all the requirements on how rich the benefit packages have to be, that the prices have really priced millions of people out of the market. So when you look at one of the reasons that they are doing, they're proposing increasing the eligibility is because so many people simply can't afford the insurance, even unless they're heavily subsidized. So, Doug, let's talk a little bit about the time frame. What parts of this plan do you think they're going to try to push through in this so-called COVID relief bill, which is a minority, a very small percentage of the funding is actually for COVID? Do Republicans and moderates have any say? A lot of people are very worried about the budget implications as well. So sort of a multi-part question.
Yeah, just by way of process. So Congress passed a budget resolution earlier this year and told the various committees to write legislation that would increase the deficit by an estimated $1.9 trillion over the next year or two. That is called a budget reconciliation bill. These bills that people are working on, that includes the Obamacare subsidies and the Medicaid expansions that Brian just reviewed. And they hope to pass this through the House next week and through the Senate very shortly thereafter. Now, budget reconciliation bill, as many of you may recall, cannot be filibustered in the Senate. There are limitations on amendments, and it can pass by simple majority, including, if necessary, a vote by Vice President Harris to make a 51 to 50 majority. So there it is. You know, Democrats have to hold their line on this because they have a small majority in the House and obviously a razor thin one in the Senate. But as far as the influence of moderate Republicans, as people may recall, 10 Republican moderate senators met with the president a couple of weeks ago and tried to say, can we work together on a package that would get bipartisan support? The answer was no. They are going to try to pass this on partisan lines. I don't think there's going to be much opportunity for compromise. Although, again, if they start to lose Democratic support, they may need to reach out to Republicans, and there may be some opportunity for discussion. I certainly don't think that's very likely. As far as the budget impact, it actually cuts both ways. I mean, there used to be a group of people that cared about the budget. Last year, the federal government spent twice as much as it collected in taxes. Twice as much as it collected in taxes. And we're on a pathway to do that again this year. Certainly this $1.9 trillion bill will push it in that direction. So there may be some concern somewhere about the national debt, but it doesn't seem to be prominent in either party. And in fact, the argument is the other way. Some people are arguing that this is too small, that the risk is that a stimulus bill of this sort won't do enough to generate a recovery. And I would remind you that 12 years ago, when there was a similar conversation about President Obama's first stimulus bill, President Biden said in a question and answer with himself, quote, "You're telling me we have to go spend money to keep from going bankrupt?" The answer to that is yes, that's what I'm telling you. So Vice President Biden believed that 12 years ago, and President Biden believes that more now, that we need to spend our way out of our debt problem.
So Doug, what of the parts of the Biden health reform, unquote, plan, do you think they're going to try to push through with, on this simple majority reconciliation $1.9 trillion deficit spending bill?
Well, I think Brian's outlined that very well. You have increases in Obamacare subsidies, most of which will go to people who already get Obamacare subsidies, some of which will go to people in the top two income quintiles. The effect on the insurance coverage, as Brian said, is relatively minimal. We're increasing Obamacare spending by about a third. It'll be $17 billion per year in addition to the $50 billion we already spend. And the net increase in newly insured is about 1.3 million, according to CBO. As far as giving free Obamacare to people on unemployment, CBO says basically those people already have coverage. They're just going to go from private coverage into the government subsidized coverage. Private sector can't compete with free. We'll see what happens on the Medicaid front as these inducements are put in place. What they're not trying to do in this bill is, one, do these permanently. These are basically a 2-year extension. They have to make it permanent. That will probably be put off to a second reconciliation bill. And of course, the other piece on the agenda, the public option, there's a big question as to whether you can do that in the reconciliation process. They're not going to test that assumption now. They probably will later in the year. Right now, they have a bill that absolutely delights the medical industrial complex. It's the same crew that passed Obamacare in 2009, the insurance industry, the hospitals, and others. In this case, unlike them, the Chamber of Commerce is lining up behind the expansions that are on this bill that Congress is currently writing. If they move to the public option, that will change and they'll run into resistance. So that's going to face both a procedural hurdle that they might not be able to do it through reconciliation, and potentially a political hurdle that the groups that are backing them now will draw the line at the public option.
So much like Obamacare, the coverage expansions, the new spending, for many people, it's going to replace private coverage with publicly subsidized coverage, which I think does point to the agenda that you all talked about earlier, that there really is an agenda to put more and more people on the public dole one way or another. So I want to get to Brian in a minute to talk about Medicaid, but I wonder, Doug, if you could just give us a quick description of what this public option is and what it would do if it were enacted to the private health insurance market.
Well, the public option, as it's called, would be a government-run insurance company. That's not exactly, the government obviously doesn't compete on the same ground as insurers, but the idea would be that this would be an offering on the exchange alongside private health insurance. Now, the one place we've seen this happen is in the state of Washington. And there, the idea of creating a public option was resisted by hospitals, doctors, and insurance companies. But they all got in the room and worked out a compromise. For hospitals, the problem is that government rates, particularly through Medicare, are much lower than commercial rates. They argue that they can't make a go of it, that they actually lose money on Medicare patients. And so they did not want to accept Medicare rates. For insurance companies, of course, they said if they are paying these low rates, their premiums will be lower than what we can charge, and therefore they're going to take our business away. So they got together and they worked out a payment rate that was acceptable to hospitals. And they said to the insurance companies, look, we'll contract with you to run this, so you won't have to accept any insurance risk. You just get paid a fee from the state to actually run the public option. I think if they ultimately do move in sort of creating a public option in Congress, it probably will look a lot like what happened in Washington State, where you can co-opt the interest groups and convince them that they'll do just as well under this as under the current regime. But for now, those groups are maintaining strong opposition to any sort of public option.
And many people do really fear that if you have the public option competing with private plans that don't have the advantages, even in a more modest way, that it really is a slow road to getting rid of the private health insurance market. So Brian, you mentioned earlier that the real effect of Obamacare has been to put millions more people on Medicaid. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the basics of Medicaid, why this is not a good idea, how it fits into the program that President Biden is talking about.
Sure. So Medicaid was created again in the mid-1960s, same legislation that created Medicare. It's a federal-state partnership. And traditionally, it served certain categories of low-income enrollees, low-income children, low-income pregnant women, low-income seniors, low-income individuals with disability. The key to sort of understanding the economics of the Medicaid program is that the federal government provides an open-ended reimbursement of state medical expenditures. So prior to for those traditional populations, if a state spends $100, the federal government will come in and cut the state a check for, on average, about $60. What Obamacare did was create a new class of enrollees in Medicaid, sort of this able-bodied, working-age adult population, and they changed the dynamic. They changed the economics because they put in place a much higher reimbursement rate for that population. So that reimbursement rate, so the expansion started in 2014. For the first 3 years, the federal government paid 100% of the cost of the expansion. And then starting in 2017, the federal reimbursement rate declined. And in 2020, it reached 90%. So right now, the federal government pays 90% of state expenditures on the expansion population. And even so, one of the sort of perverse things of this open-ended reimbursement, and this has gone back decades, it predates Obamacare, is that when the federal government tells states that it's just going to cut them a check based on their spending on Medicaid, states can come up with artificial expenditures. So in effect, telling the federal government that they're spending more on Medicaid than they actually are because they've designed these accounting gimmicks. So the federal government, in essence, is providing states money for nothing on top of sort of what the statutory design is. Another thing I should say, that the reimbursement rate for the traditional population varies by the wealth of the state. So the design was to provide more federal support for poorer states who were less able to finance healthcare and long-term care needs of these more vulnerable populations. That's the theory. Now, it hasn't worked out like that in practice. In practice, wealthier states have spent much more generously through the Medicaid program. And as a result, they receive far more in federal funding per individuals enrolled in Medicaid than less wealthy states. So there's huge inequities across states in sort of federal support for lower income populations. What we saw with Obamacare is that the incentives sort of played out the way you would expect. States got 100% reimbursement for the expansion population. They had very little incentive to care whether enrollees in Medicaid were eligible for the program. And this has been confirmed by numerous government audits. They basically didn't pay any attention to ensure that only people who met the eligibility criteria would be enrolled in the program. So you have just last November, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services releasing a report that shows that improper spending in the Medicaid program is now more than 1 out of every $5 for an improper payment rate in excess of 21%. And even that's an understatement because they haven't properly reviewed all the states yet. In fact, improper Medicaid spending, so this is spending in violation of program rules, exceeds $100 billion. And that is driven by the expansion.
So what do you think that the Biden administration is going to do specifically? The 100% paying states 100%, if they, ones who haven't expanded enrolled, sign up?
So there's about a dozen states that haven't expanded their Medicaid program yet. And they haven't expanded their Medicaid program for a variety of reasons. One of the main reasons not for states not to expand their Medicaid programs, in addition to sort of the unsustainable budget pressure that they get, and enrollment and spending in all states that have expanded is off the charts. But it really does create a major inequity when you have the government paying greater rates for sort of this able-bodied working age population than it does for traditional Medicaid enrollees. You know, there's only so many healthcare resources that providers can supply to individuals. And when you have this sort of crush of people coming into the medical system, it does crowd out services for this traditional Medicaid population. And we've seen academic studies that have shown that the quality of care for sort of this traditional Medicaid population has declined in states that have adopted the expansion. That said, it is a priority of the Democrats at the federal level and in many state capitals to get states to adopt Medicaid expansion. And there has been some success in the last couple of years with a referendum put on the ballot in states that hadn't expanded to get to take this question to the voters. And you've had some very close ballot initiatives that have adopted, where states have adopted Medicaid expansion. This most recent legislation that has passed out of the Energy and Commerce Committee would increase states' federal reimbursement rate for all their Medicaid populations by 5% for a 2-year period for states that adopt the expansion. There's other proposals that I've seen that would allow states that adopt the expansion just to have the federal government cover 100% of the costs of the expansion for a few years. So that's going to present challenges in many state capitals across the country that haven't expanded Medicaid.
So I think we can anticipate seeing taxpayer money used to bribe the states that haven't expanded, including Texas, to expand Medicaid. But I think the point that you're making, that we have made from the beginning, is that by putting so many people on Medicaid, including people who have other options for coverage, putting them on this program does make it much more difficult for people who have no other options. Moms, babies, disabled, the disabled, others who are the core constituency for Medicaid. It makes it much more difficult for them to get access to physicians. I think there's some parallels here also, Doug, with the proposal to expand Medicare to allow people who are 55, 60 to buy into Medicare. How would that work?
Well, yeah, you're exactly right. Remember when I talked at the outset about the goal of the left has never changed in terms of having the government fund all and control the allocation of all medical goods and services, and that Medicare was a compromise back in the mid-60s. And over all of these many years that have intervened, they have never reduced the Medicare age to 65. Back when people were concerned about deficits and debt, the idea was we should raise the retirement age because at the time, life expectancies, at the time Medicare was enacted, life expectancies were lower. And so we're supporting an ever growing number of people as baby boomers retire for an ever lengthening set of years, which is why Medicare is slated to become insolvent by 2024. So now we go in the opposite direction, and the direction that the founders of Medicare at first envisioned, that we begin to creep that age downward. President Biden has called for bringing it down to 60. Others have called it, including some conservatives, have called for reducing it to age 55. Now, the first thing you've got to understand about this when they say reducing the Medicare eligibility age is that this is not Medicare as we know it. Medicare is financed for the Part A, the hospital inpatient portion, by payroll taxes that workers pay. And those payroll taxes, as I mentioned, are not adequate to sustain the program for more than another 2 or 3 years. So you can't put more people suddenly on that financing system. Secondly, the premiums are subsidized by about 75% out of general revenue, and you've got to figure out, how do we finance this? Basically through debt. I mean, the government would have to borrow more in order to do the Medicare expansion. You couldn't fund it out of payroll taxes. You'd have to set premiums at a rate that made sense, both from a fiscal perspective and from the perspective of attracting people. But you would think that if they're able to do this, employers would try to offload more of their older workers onto the Medicare program and out of their employer-sponsored coverage. The rub on this, again, is the question of how much do hospitals and doctors get paid. Hospitals in particular do not want to have another large influx of people that are paying the Medicare rate as opposed to the commercial insurance rate. And they have the political heft to do that. But of course, the more that this so-called Medicare program pays the hospitals, that's the more expense that either goes to the federal government in terms of more debt, or to the individuals who participate in terms of higher premiums. So squaring that circle, keeping the hospitals happy, and at the same time adding people to a program that is on the verge of insolvency, that's the big challenge they're going to face. And again, they're not tackling it in this bill, in the $1.9 trillion bill that Congress is looking at now. But I think we can expect to see them try to make a run at this later this year.
And it shows again that this is just another way of getting people out of private insurance and onto the government role, and really enticing them to do that. But paying providers so much less that it really becomes much more difficult for them to operate with the quality of care that they do now. We have a lot of questions in the chat and also in the Q&A. I do encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. It's easier to find them there. But let's just, I want to end our discussion here on a positive note and really talk about two things. Brian, some of the work that you did when you were in the administration that we need to protect, that increased choice and competition in the health sector. And then we'll turn to Doug to ask him to talk about whether or not Republicans actually do have a plan and an idea. So Brian?
Thanks, Grace Marie. You know, a lot of that work was really motivated starting in the fall of 2017, after sort of going through 9 months of the quote unquote repeal and replace exercise, when the Trump administration really wanted to take actions to help people who had been harmed by a loss of coverage, affordable coverage options, and inject as much competition into the healthcare markets as possible. So the president signed an executive order in the fall of 2017, which led to several actions that expanded options for consumers. The first was to expand small businesses' ability to join together to get some of the regulatory advantages and economies of scale that large businesses get when they offered coverage. That was through an expansion of association health plans. The second was an expansion of something called short-term limited duration insurance. Really here, a large part of what we did was undo Obama administration restrictions that they issued at the end of 2016 that prevented people from purchasing sort of these alternatives to ACA plans, which are much more flexible and much more affordable for individuals. We expanded consumers' ability to benefit from those plans. And then perhaps the most far-reaching action that we took was something called individual coverage health reimbursement arrangements. So through individual coverage HRAs, and conservatives have long talked about sort of defined contribution health insurance, where there is so much control really that others have over our health insurance and our health care. What we should focus on is returning as much control to the consumer as possible. What the individual coverage HRA rule did is say, instead of the employer selecting the group plan, that everybody at that employer gets to choose, or not enroll in, they can provide tax-free contribution, and that worker can then go pick a plan in the individual market that works best for them. So for employers, it gives them a way to get out of sort of the traditional health insurance business. For employees, it increases their choice and control over their coverage. In contrast to Obamacare, and I mentioned earlier, $50 billion annual subsidies to increase individual market enrollment by 2 million. Projections are that the individual coverage HRA rule will increase the size of the individual market by 8 million or more people with no new federal spending. What we're doing is taking advantage of the employer contributions, improving the individual market, having health insurance be more portable so that your health insurance isn't tied to your job, which is really an important conservative policy aim, and also something that many Democrats are sympathetic to. And I think really is sort of foundational for how conservatives can think about reforming health financing going forward. Just some updates on those 3 regulations. Association health plans got off to a good start, but we had a federal judge, and really this is a sign of the vulnerability of administrative actions. We had a federal judge who I think was erroneous and said this was an end run around Obamacare. It really wasn't at all. This was employer-sponsored insurance coverage. It was very generous, expansive coverage. But he knocked down the AHP rule, and it's sort of been stuck in purgatory for almost 2 years now. Short-term plans, the estimates are there were 3 million people who were enrolled in short-term plans in 2019, and I just did a recent study from the Galen Institute that really looked at one of the left's big criticisms of the rule. They were pretty vocal that the rule was going to take healthy people out of the ACA individual market, which would worsen the individual market, lead to higher premiums and insurers exiting the individual market. And this actually made for a nice test because about half the states have permitted short-term plans and about half the states have placed restrictions on short-term plans. And it turns out that the critics were wrong on every dimension. States that fully permit short-term plans have had better enrollment trends, much better trends of insurer participation. So a lot of insurers coming into the ACA compliant individual market, and they've had greater premium declines than states that restricted short-term plans. So, I mean, I expect still the Biden administration to do rulemaking to restrict Americans' options to purchase short-term plans. Again, they're focused on getting as many people into the ACA markets as possible. But I'm hopeful that sort of this research is going to be helpful to defend the short-term market and defeat potential proposals to restrict short-term. The HRA rule really just started in January of 2020 when employers could first start making those available. I estimate there's probably a few 100,000 employees that are enrolled in the individual market using these arrangements, but there's a lot of encouraging signs. So there was Willis Towers Watson did a survey of large employers and found that about 1 in 7 were interested in offering the individual coverage HRA. And my hope is, again, through choice and competition, that you get employers moving employees into the individual market using the HRA. That creates a more robust, attractive individual market for insurers. So you get insurers moving into the individual market with greater competition and greater choice. The individual market becomes even more attractive for employees to move employees into the individual market. So you've sort of got this positive, virtuous cycle where the choice and competition through the HRA rule can improve the individual market for insurance. I'll mention one more major policy change, price transparency. So the Trump administration issued 2 rules that require hospitals to provide prices in advance of to consumers and employers in advance of them purchasing care, and also to health insurance companies to provide price information. You know, one of the really perverse things about healthcare markets is that hardly anybody knows what prices are. And prices can discipline behavior on both the consumer side and the supplier side. And if you think about when prices really matter, when does knowing prices really matter? When it's a big part of our budget, and healthcare is about 20% or more of our budget, and when there's widespread variation in prices. And there's the price variation in healthcare is quite literally, it's insane how large the differences in prices can be for the same service. And I think what the price transparency efforts really, you know, assuming we get compliance and we get this price information out there, and I think that's still an open question, but they're going to allow consumers to know price differences, and a lot of consumers are in high deductible health plans, and that information will benefit them. But crucially for employers in monitoring the insurance company that they have hired to manage their benefit plan. There's a lot of these insurance companies that I don't think are really serving the employer well. And I think the price information is going to help employers monitor those insurers, as well as design different benefit structures that incentivize employees to use high quality, low cost providers. So I think, you know, the price transparency rule, the hospital rule just took effect January 1st. There has sort of mixed evidence right now, or I'd say the evidence is that hospitals are not fully complying. Some are, but a lot aren't. But, you know, I think price transparency does hold potential to introduce a lot of competitive forces in the markets.
And thank you, Brian. All of these policies that you described, I do not believe would have happened without your heroic work in the White House to push them through. And I just want to underscore that the difference really here is that we believe that consumers and markets can work together with proper oversight to get prices down, increase choices, and ultimately get to higher quality, that people will do the same thing they do in the health sector, given more options. And that's what you're trying to do with association health plans, with short-term limited duration plans. You've already seen benefits to the market from those, as well as health reimbursement arrangements, which are basically a defined benefit, a defined contribution for employers to be able to give the value of that part of their salary that's going to support their health insurance. Instead of having that go to the insurance company, allow the employee to be able to make choices. And then that, as you said, Brian, it forces the market to respond with better choices, to compete for that business, as we have seen in the Medicare Part D program, for example, which Doug ushered through when he was in the George W. Bush White House. So Doug, let's talk a little bit about building on that platform of choice and competition. What is the Republican? Do the Republicans have any ideas for legislation?
Yeah, I think they do. And Grace Marie, you're one of the reasons behind that. Grace Marie has pulled together, as you mentioned, the Healthcare Consensus Group, and we have a proposal that is very widely supported among conservative activists. And the Republican Study Committee has outlined a plan that very strong, but very heavily borrows from this. The core of it is to say, it's sort of like welfare reform. Let's end the Obamacare entitlement, replace it with a program of grants to states, just as we did with welfare reform back in the 1990s, and base the amount of the money to states on their proportion of low-income people. As Brian said, right now, Medicaid rewards the states that spend most profligately. We should base it not on how much they spend, but on the needs of people within the state. Secondly, we say to the states that they have to subsidize low-income people, come up with some way to do that, however you do it. as well as those with pre-existing medical conditions. One of the failures of Obamacare is that it shuts out people with pre-existing medical conditions from the best providers. Not a single Obamacare plan sold in the state of Texas includes MD Anderson in its network. So the good news is your cancer care is covered if you're on Obamacare. The bad news is you may not be getting it from some of the best providers of cancer care in the world. The assistance, the other thing that states have to do with the assistance is to say to people, low-income people, you can apply this assistance to the plan of your choice. Right now, we balkanize the poor. You think about a family of three. Mom may be on Medicaid because she's pregnant. The 5-year-old child may be on the Children's Health Insurance Program because he's a child, and dad may be on the Obamacare exchanges because he doesn't qualify for that. If you put all that assistance together and said to the family, look, you can enroll in dad's the plan sponsored by dad's insurer, or you can buy a single family plan on the individual market. Low-income people should have choice. It's basically the school choice analog applied to healthcare. As far as policies for people with pre-existing conditions, the state must have that there. You cannot say to people with pre-existing conditions that they have no options. So there have to be those programs there. But as Brian has done in some of the regulatory work he did for the Trump administration, that's not the only thing there. There should be other insurance options available to people aside from those plans, so that people are choosing the coverage that's best for themselves and is best for their families. So a lot of things that is included in this plan is codifying the things that Brian and the Trump administration did administratively, writing it into law so that it's not easily repealed, and it's harder for judges to say that it violates the statute because the statute actually creates that. So again, if a state wants to, with its allocation, just keep Obamacare as it is, if that's what they choose to do, they can, but it's not open-ended anymore. They get a fixed allotment from the federal government, and if they want to run things inefficiently, if they want to keep premiums high, then they'll have to figure out a way to subsidize it. They're not going to get a dollar for dollar increase in federal assistance for every dollar they raise in premiums as under the current regime. So that's an outline of what we're looking at. It is something that, again, is built on choice and competition. Instead of subsidizing high premiums, it reduces premiums. An independent analysis that was done by the Center on Health and the Economy said that our proposal would reduce premiums by 24%, that it would increase the number of people that have coverage, that it would save the federal government money, that it would increase choices of providers that people have right now, and that it would increase healthcare productivity. So there are alternatives out there. It's not if you want low-income people and people with pre-existing conditions to have coverage, it has to be Obamacare. There's no other way to do it. There actually are much better ways to do it, and ways that limit government's influence and control and return medical care to doctors and their patients.
That's an excellent analysis, and I really want to reiterate that the Healthcare Choices Plan does do a better job of directly supporting people with pre-existing conditions. Instead of throwing them into the same pool with everybody else, making it difficult for them to get the specialists that they need and causing premiums to increase for everybody else, that this actually provides direct funding for people with pre-existing conditions and for the state to create programs that work for that state. So I put a link to the Healthcare Choices website in the chat room, healthcarechoices2020.org. So take a look there. You'll see that we've got support of more than 80 health policy experts from around the country. So it's a well thought out plan, and one that I think can move us more in the direction of the choice and competition that Brian was talking about earlier. We have a lot of questions. It's not going to be possible, I think, unless we stay here all evening, to go through every one. So I'm going to try to see if I can combine a few. We've had a couple of questions about Obamacare, saying that it actually has made a huge difference in resolving health disparities, and others have charged the Trump administration with doing everything they could to sabotage Obamacare. But then we have Joantos, also from the American Enterprise Institute, our good friend and colleague, who's asking Brian to provide references for his statement about poor quality and access to services for Medicare enrollees in states that expanded Medicaid. So I wonder, just throw that question out. You want to take the Medicaid expansion part first, Brian, and then Doug, if you want to answer some of the questions about what the Trump administration actually did with Obamacare. Brian, you could take that too.
Good, because I want to start there. I know one of the narratives that I find most frustrating is the sabotage narrative. And actually the Trump administration, the focus was to expand coverage after the legislative failure of 2017, to expand coverage opportunities in every way that was possible, and to help make the individual markets work better. So we approved more than a dozen states to get these waivers through a section of Obamacare, Section 1332, that allows states to waive certain requirements. And we authorized these reinsurance programs where the state government put up some money for a reinsurance program where taxpayers would subsidize insurers for high-cost enrollees, for a large part of the high-cost enrollees' care. That resulted in lower premiums, significantly lower premiums on average by about 20%, and lower premium tax credits or lower subsidies. And the federal government then shared that portion back with the state, so that the state would get, on average, about 60% of its money back from what it initially put forward. But approving 1332 waivers, clearly the HRA rule, which is about integration with ACA compliant plans, both helped the individual health insurance market. And it turns out, one of the things, the individual mandate penalty was eliminated, but that really wasn't effective in inducing anybody to purchase coverage. So we said that the whole time. It was one of the main reasons that the replace efforts were very unpopular, is because of these large coverage losses that you got from CBO, assuming that when you eliminate the individual mandate penalty, that would lead to significant loss of coverage. That was a pure fiction. It's to this day, I still hold, I'm still disappointed in CBO not accepting the overwhelming evidence before 2017, when it was clear that the individual mandate was not going to be that effective. But there really weren't. Decreasing the open enrollment period. So the open enrollment period for the first several years was 12 weeks. The Obama administration, in their last regulation, proposed reducing it to 6 weeks starting in 2019, with the thought that a shorter open enrollment period would reduce some of the gaming that was going on with the exchanges. The Trump administration just said, yeah, we think that there is gaming going on. We're going to move the 6 week open enrollment period up 1 year. So we're going to start it in 2018 instead of 2019. To the Medicaid question, I released a paper through the Texas Public Policy Foundation last April that assessed the health impact of the Medicaid expansion, and really there's a contrast between expansion states and non-expansion states. And when you look at mortality trends overall, this is pretty pretty simple analysis. But when you look at mortality trends, actually, the mortality trends were bad in both states, but they were less bad in states that didn't adopt the expansion. And there may be some reasons related to Medicaid expansion enrollees getting easier access to opioids during that period. But I also then go through a couple of studies on specifically Medicaid expansion crowding out services for traditional Medicaid enrollees. I know one of them, it increased ambulance response time for Medicaid enrollees, for traditional Medicaid enrollees in Medicaid expansion states.
Thank you very much. Actually, we have an anonymous attendee who has a question for Tom Giovanetti. So Tom, you're on mute, but I'm going to ask you a question. What confidence do you have that the parliamentarian will rule correctly when the Byrd rule is violated or on other reconciliation rules? And also you had a question about, do you suppose that federal employees, including Congress, would go along with Biden's plan if they had to be in the plan? I'm going to ask you a two-part question.
Okay, well, thanks. That's a little bit unexpected, Grace Marie, but I'm happy to help out. My cynical view is that the Senate parliamentarian will do whatever the Senate leadership wants it to do, and I never thought that I would become a fan of former Senator Byrd, but it looks like the Byrd rule is about the only thing standing between us and a complete lack of fiscal discipline on the part of the Senate, unfortunately. But it is interesting, isn't it, that an arcane rule interpreted by an appointed Senate staffer will be the hinge for whether or not something gets through on reconciliation or whether it doesn't. Would federal employees prefer to be thrown into the Obamacare exchanges? I think we already know the answer to that. We know the answer to that because there were only a tiny number of members of Congress, for instance, who chose to participate. Some of them did voluntarily, I think maybe for symbolic purposes, but almost none of them did. And healthcare policy experts know this, but some of our attendees may not. And that is that federal employees, as well as state employees, are the beneficiaries of some of the most generous healthcare plans and healthcare systems of any workers in the country. They get tremendous benefits, fully subsidized for their entire families in many cases, much better policies. The government class tends to favor itself, I think, with much better benefits than are often available in the private sector.
Thank you, Tom. So Bob Hyde, you've got your name here. The question comes from you, talks about Dallas County, saying it has an excellent county hospital system known as Parkland. It's mainly funded by county property taxes, and several neighborhoods don't have their own hospital. Will the legislation that's coming through Washington and the Biden administration provide incentives for local counties to establish their own county hospitals? Brian, Doug, you want to take that?
Yeah, I can take that. There's nothing specific in the legislation Congress is considering now that would do that. Now, there's a lot of money obviously going to the states, and there's a lot of money going to hospitals in this bill, as in the earlier 4 COVID bills that Congress has passed over the last 11 months or so. But I'm not aware of anything that I've seen, at least. Now, it's a huge bill, I will tell you that. But at least as I've read it, I don't see anything that would necessarily finance that. But again, there's a lot of, I can't say for sure it's not there.
There's still a lot of unknowns. So we actually have a call from Steve Parente, a note from Steve Parente here. Can Brian or Doug talk about the proposed COBRA expansion that Democrats are proposing, and you can describe what that is? And we had a related one about, will ERISA self-insured plans be affected by President Biden's proposed changes to the ACA? So that's sort of a two-part question. Go, guys.
Yeah, on COBRA, Steve, they've what they've set up. COBRA, for people who don't know, is that you can, after leaving your previous employer, you can continue to be enrolled in that employer-sponsored health plan if you pay the entire premium plus a small administrative cost. That is both what you were contributing as an employee and also what your employer pays into the plan. Under this bill, for the next basically 6 months, the federal government will pick up 85% of COBRA premiums. So between now and the end of September. Congressional Budget Office estimates that that's a net cost to the federal government of about $10 billion in a rather short period of time, and that it would almost triple the number of people who take advantage of COBRA, from about 1.3 million to about 3.5 million. But again, of those who would enroll in COBRA and take advantage of those subsidies, only 600,000 would have otherwise been uninsured. So over a period of this 6 months, you would insure about 600,000 people at a net cost to the government of $10 billion. Most of what would happen, at least according to CBO's analysis of it, is that people who already have coverage would take advantage of the COBRA subsidy and buy into their former employer's plan.
Brian, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't talk about one of the key features of Biden's health proposal that was in his 2020 platform, because it's not part of the reconciliation bill. But he has, I'm going to say it's breaking the firewall proposal, but it's potentially the most profound politically feasible thing that he has proposed on Obamacare. So there's a firewall in place. So one of the issues to understand is if you get insurance through the workplace, you receive a tax benefit. The premiums aren't subject to federal income or payroll taxes. Obamacare came in, they didn't address that tax benefit. They kept that in place. They put a Cadillac tax, an excise tax for expensive coverage, but Congress has repealed that on a bipartisan basis. That never had a natural constituency. Maybe Steve Parenti and me and supported the Cadillac tax. That's probably, and maybe some people on this call were health economists, but we were not a very powerful constituency. So you've got the exclusion in place, but now you've got the premium tax credits, and the premium tax credits are much larger for lower income people and for people who are who are closer to age 65 to really over the age of 50. And that presents a powerful incentive for employers to drop coverage or to reconfigure coverage to take advantage of those subsidies. Now, we've seen limited employer drop to date, much less than expected because of Obamacare. And I think that's because the coverage just wasn't that appealing to employers and to workers. But if they expand these subsidies and they make that the subsidy expansion permanent, or this firewall is going to be increasingly, I think, important to keep the budgetary pressure down. If they breaking the firewall means is that an employee can have the decision whether to take the group plan or to take the exchange plan with a tax credit. So you can see separation and people going to purchase plans that work best for them. And you can see a lot of lower income, older people moving into the exchanges with these large tax credits. That might sound great, like employees moving to purchase what works best for them, but it's incredibly expensive. And there's been analyses done that if you allow this attrition to happen, the lower income people tend to be the younger people at firms. So it would create adverse selection in employer plans, which would create this cycle where employers start dropping coverage. Chris Jacobs did an analysis of this, and Chris Jacobs is a health policy expert. He estimated that breaking the firewall could lead to 24 million employers dropping coverage and a $2.2 trillion cost over a decade from that. And Avalere Health actually has its own sets of estimates, and they have a higher projected loss where 18 million people could migrate to the exchanges voluntarily because it's better, it's in their self-interest. But another 14 million people lose their employer plan because the employer it doesn't make sense for the employer to drop coverage anymore.
So once again, we get to the theme that the policies that conservatives offer would give new incentives, boost choice and competition to make the market work better, to get to lower prices, higher quality, more choices, where so many of the proposals by the other side really are lures to get more and more people to enroll in government coverage. We had a question here that is relevant to this. With the Biden administration starting a new special enrollment period into the Obamacare exchanges, how do you see this impacting risk pools and healthcare in general? The impact of this special enrollment period that I think started February 15th, yesterday. Who wants to take that? Doug, you want to take that?
Yeah, I can take it. It's hard to say. Obviously, two things are going on at once. One is this 3-month special enrollment period that will run through May. So the people who have not signed up now during the open season that occurred toward the end of last year have a second chance. And Congress considering legislation to greatly increase the subsidies. I would say that if Congress does increase the subsidies, you could see a lot of people, more people getting into exchange-based coverage. Now, again, from CBO's perspective, it's not so much uninsured people who will be getting coverage. It's more people who have insurance, as Brian says, seeing this now as a better deal. It's people who are on unemployment insurance getting free coverage. And it's people who, and the big 2/3 of the money is people who are already enrolled in Obamacare, already getting subsidies, who now would get much larger subsidies. How that affects the risk pool is hard to say. One of the things that CBO found in its analysis is that the people most likely to benefit from from allowing subsidies to go to people in the top 2 income quintiles will be people in their late 50s and early 60s. And so you already have a risk pool now in the exchanges that's more or less top heavy, as Brian has covered. If you get a disproportionate number of new enrollees who are older adults, then it would adversely affect the risk pool. But I've not seen any comprehensive analysis or projections of what the composition of the risk pool would look like once this open season is over. But there is a possibility that it might be just as adverse, if not more adverse, as it is now.
So I have to tell you, we have so many good questions. We could go on for a long time. I want to ask one more sort of final question. It's really more of a comment, I think, from several of our attendees. And then Tom, I will turn it over to you to conclude and tell people, we've had several people asking how they can access the recording. You guys have just been terrific, but I think these poignant concluding questions is that one person says, the crux of the dilemma we're facing, in my opinion, is one of messaging. We've lost the messaging narrative, right or wrong. Uninformed voters are more easily swayed by the lure of a system rather than the reality of how it would work. And then a similar comment, as you two have said, the Biden administration's plans are guided by drowning states and K Street in a tsunami of dollars. Medicaid receiving double-digit billions, exchanges increasing number, putting more money into COBRA, trying to buy off employers. So they're basically saying, do you see light at the end of the tunnel, and is it a train coming at us?
Brian, you
want me to go first?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's obviously, it's a tough situation right now. And I think messaging has not been the strength of conservatives over the past several years on health policy. I also think we've got a media that tends to be pretty unfriendly to conservative ideas. So it's really hard. I do think the message of supporting consumers and patients and empowering them with more information is a winning issue. If you go through some of the items, like should people know prices in advance, that's a 95% favorable answer. And that's something that, you know, conservatives have put in place over the last couple of years. I do think one way to divide the left is really to play up this crony capitalism narrative in healthcare. There is no more powerful special interest at the federal level and at the state level than the medical industrial complex. And they are fed, like, I mean, we've talked about, by government rules that protect them from competition. Now, a lot of those rules are enacted by states, and there are things like certificate of need laws or narrow scope of practice laws that prevent providers and suppliers from delivering care to individuals that need them. So those are things that we should be fighting on at a state level to expand supply and inject as much competition into markets as possible. And then, I mean, all of these subsidies are, one, they're unsustainable. Like healthcare costs for the American family and for our budgets are unsustainable, and we keep going in the wrong direction. But really, I think the winning narrative should be, and this is in the main part of the healthcare choices proposal, that we're just spending so much money inefficiently and wastefully. Let's get these resources to the consumer. And we've seen, I mean, Doug can talk about how, you know, we have examples of this working with Part D, but where we get the subsidy, we get resources to the consumer, and then let them choose among a variety of alternatives, and let the market have to serve the average American consumer.
Doug, you get the last word. You're on your move. There you go.
Well, very, very little I can add to what Brian said. I think I think he's exactly right. As I mentioned at the top, the core belief of the left is that government can allocate medical goods and services more efficiently and more fairly than can markets. And as I'm perusing through, these are some great questions. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. As somebody has observed, the left has a ready talking point. Healthcare will be free. You will go to the doctor and you will no longer get a bill. You will go to the pharmacy and you'll no longer have to pay for your medicines at the prescription counter. But as we all know, it's not free. And as we all know, that in pretty much every aspect of our lives, that markets work better. When prices are transparent, when providers of goods or services have to compete for our loyalty and for our dollars, when we get to choose what's best for us and what's best for our families, there is no more efficient system that's ever been devised by the human race than that. And it is a system that is better. We are terrible, awful at advocating for that. We are awful in conveying to people, do you think you're better off making medical decisions for yourself, or do you think that's best left to people in Washington who have the expertise? As Brian said, that's a 90+% polling proposition, but somehow we do a very poor job of communicating that, and we really need to get better in a hurry.
So perhaps, though, despite our inadequacy in messaging and communication, the American people really are with us in hearts and minds. They know they want choice. They know that they want health providers, hospitals, insurance companies responding to their needs, not the needs of some Washington bureaucrat. They know that price controls ultimately lead to rationing and to much lower quality, as we see around the world. So despite the promises of free this and that, I think the American people, given the options that we're offering with the Healthcare Choices Plan and others, that they will be with us. And we just have to work very hard to get that message out. And there are a lot of people in Congress who are wanting to figure out, how do we get the message back? And that's our job going forward. So Tom, I just want to thank you and Meryl and Abstencia for giving us the opportunity to talk about these issues today. I think we could do a regular series based upon the very intelligent questions we're getting here in the chat to do this again sometime.
We did get very good questions, and I'm as impressed with some of the questions from the audience as I was with the content from our panelists. And the other thing I want to say, Grace Murray, is to the degree that the American people do believe those things and know those things, it's largely because of the work of people like you and Doug and Brian at the Galen Institute and that sort of thing. And but we have plenty of opportunity to improve on that and do a better job going forward, don't we?
So they'd like to know how to get to the recording, Tom.
Yes, they would. Yes, they would. So this event has been recorded and it will be available in a couple of days on both IPI's website and also the YouTube channel of the Institute for Policy Innovation. And we have a very short, we're old enough that we have a very short URL. It's just ipi.org, ipi.org. We should also mention that the Galen Institute's website is galen.org, similarly short. And so that video should be available in a few days. And we could even send out a notice to all of our attendees when that video is available so that they can share it with their friends and colleagues.
Yes, and all of the papers that both Brian and Doug have referenced are available on the Galen website at galen.org. And then finally, someone also had asked about whether or not the comments today are on the record. And I don't see any reason why not. If somebody wants to quote anything that has been said here, pretty much everything that you have said, you've written about and spoken about in other forums. So I agree. You agree? Guests have it on the record? Thumbs up. Brian, Doug?
Oh, it's on the record. if you don't want it on the record, you have to kind of decide that at the beginning.
We're on the record. That's
right.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for your leadership and always for everything that you do to fight for freedom in so many different ways. And we really are. It's a pleasure, as always, to continue to work with you in that battle.
Thank you, Grace Marie. And to all of our attendees, you can find no better resource for consumer-driven, free market-oriented healthcare policy than the website of the Galen Institute. And you will also at the IPI website find years and years worth of work by our Dr. Merrill Matthews on the same topic. So both organizations are delighted to be able to provide this content today and to be a resource going forward. So with that, we should probably wrap things up. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate that. And we wish you all a warm, for some, and a safe and healthy rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.